Okay, so this next video lecture is still the continuation of our Module 8, Accounting for Factory Overhead. So we are now in the third topic, which is about the activity-based costing. So this is ABC. Basically, under this costing method, we will assign manufacturing overhead cost to products in a more logical manner than the traditional approach of just simply allocating cost on the basis of machine hours, number of or sales, and other allocation basis. Okay, but in activity-based costing, we will first assign cost to the activities that are the real cost of overhead, meaning we will only identify those activities which actually creates overhead cost, and those activities which do not normally create or incurs manufacturing cost, it will not be allocated for such. Okay, so it then assigns the cost to those activities only, to the products that are actually demanding those activities. So to understand better, we have here an example. So product 124, this is a low volume item which requires certain activities such as special engineering, additional testing, and many machine setups because it is ordered in small quantities only. And then we also have a similar product 366. This is a high volume product and it runs continuously and only requires a little attention and no special activities. If this company used traditional costing, so the result will be it might allocate or spread all of its overhead to products based on the number of machine hours, because that is the traditional allocation basis, machine hours. So basically, this will result in little overhead to be allocated to product 124 because it's low volume, meaning it's the production of this is in low or in a lesser number of units only. Okay, so basically it will not have any, or it will have not many machine hours to be spent in production. So that's why it will be allocated a small portion of overhead cost. However, it will demand lots of engineering, testing, and setup activities. In contrast, our product 366 will be allocated a lot of the overhead costs because it will have more machine hours, okay, to be spent in production because this is high volume and continuously running process. So basically, it requires a large amount of number of machine hours. So basically, under the traditional costing, it will be allocated a larger portion of overhead cost. However, it only demands little overhead activity. So with this, the result will be a miscalculation of each product's true cost of manufacturing overhead. So activity-based costing will overcome this shortcoming because under ABC, we will assign overhead more than the one activity based on the running of the machine. Okay, or in this case, we will only be identifying the activities which basically incurs the manufacturing cost, and we will assign those costs to those products as well. Okay, that's how efficient activity-based costing is compared to the traditional costing. So activity-based costing recognizes that special engineering, special testing, machine setups, and others are activities that cause the costs. Okay, so they cause the company to consume the resources. Under ABC, the company will calculate the cost of resources used in each of these activities. And then the cost of each of these activities will be assigned only to the products that demands these activities. So in our example earlier, product 124 therefore will be assigned some of the company's cost of special engineering, special testing, and machine setup. Other products that use any of these activities will also be assigned some of their costs, while product 366 will not be assigned any of those costs. And it will be assigned only a small amount of machine setup. So with this, the allocation of overhead cost is proportionate to the use of the resources or manufacturing overhead costs. Okay, so that's how ABC works. Okay, so activity-based costing has grown in importance in the recent decades because manufacturing overhead costs have increased significantly, and manufacturing overhead costs no longer correlate with the productive machine hours or direct labor hours alone. And the diversity of products and the diversity in customers' demands have also grown, and some of the products are produced in large batches while others are produced in small batches. And this will make the difference between which products creates more or incurs more overhead costs. Okay, so to understand better the concept of ABC, let us take this illustration. So we have here two common manufacturing activities: the setting up of a production machine for running batches of products, and the second is the actual production of the units of product. So we will assume that a company has annual manufacturing overhead cost of 2 million, and out of that, 200,000 is directly involved in setting up the production machines. During the year, the company expects to perform 400 machine setups. And let us also assume that the batch sizes vary considerably, but the setup efforts for each of this machine are just the same. So the cost per setup is 500. So 200,000 of cost per year divided by 400 setups per year. Under activity-based costing, 200,000 of the overhead will be viewed as a batch level cost. So this means that 200,000 will first be allocated to batches of products to be manufactured. So this is referred to as our stage 1 allocation. And then it will be assigned to the units of product in each batch. So this is our stage 2 allocation. So for example, if batch X consists of 5,000 units of product, the setup cost is 0.10. So that's 500 divided by 5,000 units. If batch Y is 50,000 units, the cost per unit per setup will be 0.01. So that's 500 divided by 500,000 or 50,000 units. For simplicity, we will assume that the remaining 1.8 of the manufacturing overhead is caused by the production activities that correlate with the company's 100,000 machine hours. So for our simple two-activity examples, we will see how the rates for allocating the manufacturing overhead would look like with activity-based costing and without, or with the traditional costing. Okay, so with ABC, our manufacturing overhead cost assigned to setup is 200, but in traditional there is no allocation for it. Number of setups is 400. For the traditional, it's not applicable. Manufacturing overhead cost per setup as calculated earlier, it's 500. So with the traditional, it's 0. Total manufacturing overhead cost is 2 million, less cost traced to machine setup. Okay, so in traditional, we do not do that. So manufacturing overhead cost allocated on machine hours is 1.8 only, while in the traditional, it's full 2 million. And then machine hours is 100. Okay, and then for manufacturing overhead cost per machine hours, under ABC, it's only 18, but in traditional, it's full 20. Okay, so manufacturing overhead cost allocation, so that's 500 setup cost per batch plus 18 per machine hours, while for traditional, it's only purely 20 per machine hours. Okay, so in traditional, we do not allocate it to a specific activity. So next, let's see what the impact of these different allocation techniques and the overhead rates would have on the per unit cost of specific unit of output. So assume that the company manufactures a batch of 5,000 units and it produces 50 units per machine hour. So here is how we will assign the cost. For the ABC, manufacturing overhead for setting up machine is 500. Number of units is 5,000. And manufacturing overhead cost by setup per unit is 0.10. So that's 500 divided by 5,000. But under traditional costing, these are not applicable. Okay. So manufacturing overhead cost per machine hour is 18 as calculated earlier. Number of units produced per machine hour is 50. So therefore, manufacturing overhead cost by production per unit is 0.36. So that's 18 divided by 50. Okay, whereas in traditional, we use the full 20 per machine hour divided by 50. So manufacturing overhead cost by production per unit here is 0.40. So total manufacturing overhead allocated per unit under the ABC, it's 0.46. That's 0.10 plus 0.36. While in traditional, we will only have 0.40. Okay? If a company manufactures a batch of 50,000 this time and produces 50 units per machine hour, so how do we calculate the manufacturing overhead cost for ABC and traditional costing? So with ABC, for manufacturing overhead setup of the machine, so that's 500 earlier, divided by the number of units in batch of 50,000. So manufacturing overhead cost by setup per unit is 0.01. This is not applicable with traditional or without ABC. So for manufacturing overhead cost per machine hour, for ABC, we used 18. In traditional, we used 20. We will divide it by the number of units produced per machine per hour. So 18 divided 50 is 0.36, and in traditional, that's 20 divided by 50, it's 0.40. So this time, the total manufacturing overhead allocated per unit with ABC is only 0.36, and for traditional, it's 0.40. So as the table illustrated, the activity costing cost per unit decreases, okay, from 0.46 to 0.37, okay, earlier, because the cost of setup activity is spread over 50,000, meaning regardless of the number of units produced, there is the same setup activity. So therefore, if there are a lot of units produced, so it will be spread to all of these units, and the result will be a decreased manufacturing overhead per unit compared to lesser production. Okay, because in this case 0.46 pertains to 5,000 units only, and 0.37 I mean is for 50,000 units. They have the same level of machine setups and the same amount of overhead cost. So therefore, as the production or the number of units increases, the cost for overhead related to setup decreases. Okay, so that's how it is. So without ABC, the cost per unit is 0.40 still, regardless of the number of units in each batch. So if a company base their selling prices on cost and they are not using ABC approach, it might lose large batch work to a competitor, because in this case, they charge greater than the actual manufacturing cost that pertains to that production alone, if only they use ABC, okay, approach. So it's also possible that the company not using ABC may find itself being low bidder. Of course, they will incur greater amount of manufacturing cost, okay, for manufacturing the small batches of their products, since it's 0.40. Okay, with its bid based on manufacturing overhead of 0.40, but the true cost is 0.46. So the company may end up doing lots of production for little or no profit. So that's the problem. That's why in most recent years, there are a lot of number of companies, manufacturing companies that are now utilizing ABC approach. So our example with just two activities, production and setup, illustrates how the cost per unit using ABC method is more accurate in reflecting the actual efforts associated with the production. So as companies began measuring the cost of activities instead on focusing on the accountant's departmental classification, they began using ABC, okay, cost information, to practice activity-based management. For example, with the cost of setting up a machine now being measured and discussed, managers begin to ask these questions. So it will help them later on in the decision and also in allocating the cost, in determining the costs. So why is the cost of setting up a production machine so expensive? So with this question, they will be able to determine what causes this expensive machine setup cost. And if they will find it out, they will be able to control and minimize it. Okay? Another question that will help them is what can be done to reduce this setup cost? If the setup cost cannot be reduced, are the selling price adequate to cover all the costs, which include setup cost that was previously buried in overall machine or overhead rate? Okay, so these questions will help the management in decision making and also for controlling the cost, especially the manufacturing overhead costs. Okay, so those are for the concepts of activity-based costing.